Yeah, hello back. Nice to see you again, although I don't really see you. Yeah, you have now chosen a small little lecture on the second element of what makes up taxability in normal circumstances, the scope of the enterprise. So let's have a look to that. Oh, I see that slide has been wrongly animated, but I hope that doesn't distract you. Okay. Let's begin with the beginning. There is one principle which says VAT knows the structural unity of the enterprise. That is just following the nice habit of strange people called experts to coin a technical term for everything, which could also be said plainly and simply. What is meant plainly and simply is brought nearer to us by paragraph 2, section 1, sentence 2 of the Umsatzsteuergesetz of the USDG. And it says the enterprise comprises all activities undertaken by the entrepreneur. And from the expression the enterprise and not an enterprise, it's clear that it's only the one and only enterprise which an entrepreneur can have. So there is only one enterprise for one entrepreneur. So every business activity which the same person has automatically forms one and only enterprise. Only one. From this, we can draw the conclusion that everyone can have only one enterprise in the sense of value-added tax. So if you have two different businesses which you run or own, then they will nevertheless only form one enterprise in the sense of VAT. So the first consequence is if you own two businesses, well, even if they have a separate accounting, for handing in the VAT declaration, the two chief accountants will have to meet and to add up the figures and then make one single tax declaration for value-added tax purposes, probably each month. The second consequence is if you take something out of firm number 1 and contribute it to firm number 2 under income tax rules, that might be regarded as a withdrawal from the one firm and contribution into the other firm, but from the perspective of value-added tax, nothing has been happening, because from the perspective of value-added tax, only one asset was shifted to another department of the same or another part of the same enterprise. So again, here you see it makes sense to coin different technical terms for what is a business in income tax and what is an enterprise in value-added tax. Well, just to illustrate that, you see here a small little chart. Mr. Irvin Smith is the proud owner of a shoe factory. And then when, let's say, one of his parents dies, he inherits a bakery. So both are sole traderships. So the owner is in both cases Mr. Schmitz. So we have only one enterprise. Sorry, it should be enterprise, would be better on the slide. And so only one tax declaration. The same applies the other way around if we have Mr. Schmitz. And Mr. Schmitz inherited the bakery of his late father. But then Mr. Schmitz also is 100% owner of the Schmitz GmbH, and the Schmitz GmbH then runs the shoe factory. In that case, we have first Mr. Schmitz as an entrepreneur, owner of the bakery, and we have a different person, the Schmitz GmbH, owning the shoe factory. So here we have two enterprises, and therefore two tax declarations. Different persons naturally have different enterprises. There might be some very advanced listener to this lecture who might say, but there is a kind of group taxation sometimes in the field of value-added tax. which might enable us to see the Schmidt's GmbH as not independent. Forget about that. That's not a topic for beginners. And indeed, it can be designed in a way that Schmidt's GmbH is not regarded as part of a group. Depends on the very individual circumstances. So the example could work as it does here. So just believe me, two different owners, two different enterprises. Naturally, the factory is on this slide only half finished. It's going to be finished soon. Mr. Schmitz again has inherited the bakery, and Mr. Schmitz is the proud partner in the Schmitz GmbH & Co. KG, and now he owns that GmbH & Co. KG with 100%. Seems to be surprising that one partner can own the complete profit from a partnership. Under the German law, that would be possible. You can form a KG, and you know, in a KG, that's a kind of special form of a partnership. Remember General Introduction to Tax Law, Business Administration lectures. A KG is a limited partnership, so that one person is a partner who is not responsible for the debts of the partnership, and one partner is the full partner who is completely responsible to the outside world for everything which the partnership owes to the outside world. And in Germany, there is a very frequent model that one takes a GmbH, so a limited company, as the full partner of a KG. And then you have as full partner the only person who cannot really risk something because it has no feelings and no real life, a GmbH. And now that GmbH very often then can be attributed, let's begin the sentence anew. You know, then in a partnership you can freely decide how the profit is distributed between the partners. And so it's a very frequent model then to say the GmbH gets 0% in the profit and only gets a small compensation for risking its head if there is a bankruptcy. And 100% of the profit, or nearly 100% at all, go to the limited partner. This is a very clever combination which combines the effects of the sole tradership with the limitation of liability, which you can achieve under a KG. And it has tradition in Germany. So Schmitz GmbH & Co. KG, this partnership here, is now the owner of the shoe factory. And although Mr. Schmitz has a 100% share in the partnership is nevertheless independent, a different person or a different legal entity from the point of view of value-added tax. Remember last lecture. And so we have again here two owners, two businesses, owned by each individual owner, so we have two enterprises and two tax declarations. That was the difference to the case which we had before. Well, good. So this first approach shows us everything which the same entrepreneur does. It forms one single enterprise, and that's it. Now we have to think about what is part of an enterprise. Well, the legal rule just says the enterprise comprises everything which happens in the course of the enterprise. You can also translate that differently. For example, that's always the same. You know, if two people translate the same text, it will never have the same outcome in a different language. And we can have a small look on how I translated that some years ago in the TaxAct slides, which you still can use. And so let's have a small break and look on that. And you will see the message is basically the same. So here we are. In the TaxAct slides, the translation I chose there was the enterprise comprises the entire business activity of the entrepreneur. So slightly different wording as you expect when you translate into a different language from the original. You will never have an identical translation probably, but you see concerning the main points there is conformity. Also here in my first translation it's the enterprise, so only one, and the entire activities of the entrepreneur which have to do with business are part of the enterprise in the sense of VAT. Now, naturally, ladies and gentlemen, we have to find out what that means. What are the entire activities which belong to the scope of the enterprise? So, what has to do with the enterprise? And let's think about that a bit. The first conclusion we can draw is if the enterprise or the scope or the frame, range, however you want to express it in English, of the enterprise comprises everything, it must comprise the core activities or the main activities, so the core business, and everything else which happens, so which is just a part or an activity which you perform additionally and which occasionally happens in the course of the enterprise activities. These would be called ancillary activities. So you can distinguish the main activity and the ancillary activities. Let's say we have to do with now defining the distinction. Well, the main activity is what you do as your business in principle. So if we have a bakery, baking bread and selling it would be the core activity. If you check that, that is what turns the entrepreneur really into an entrepreneur, because baking bread is done independently, it's done on a constant or sustainable basis, it's done to achieve revenue. So you can tick the box and then find out, okay, this fulfills the requirements for an enterprise. Now, that would be the core activity. Now, imagine from time to time you also sell a machine which you used for production. You sell it second-hand, or you sell it for somebody who is going to use the material again and pays you some 50 euro for the aluminium or the iron contained in the machine. Probably you don't just throw it away. And now selling machines, in case of a bakery, so selling an old bakery oven second-hand is naturally nothing which you really intend to do repeatedly, but it happens in the course of an enterprise. If you run a bakery from time to time, you will also sell in order to dispose of an old machine or so. This transaction also has a relation to a connection to the enterprise. And so it is covered by our nice little sentence, the enterprise activity comprises everything which has to do with the enterprise. This would be an ancillary activity. Or our baker managed to convince some new guy or girl to take up a job in the bakery. But the guy or girl lives far away in a village, and so the baker says, in the early morning there is not yet a bus connection which is really viable for you, so how do we get you here that you can begin in the middle of your night? Well, I'll be generous, I am going to buy a car, a business car, and you will get the permission to use the business car in order to travel to the bakery and home. Yeah. In that case, if you later sell that car, also that is not the core activity of a baker, but nevertheless, it was property which belonged to the bakery, so it has a connection to the baker's business. So if you sell it, it is a part of the entrepreneurial activities, an ancillary activity. So the only things which are out of scope of the enterprise are those which have no connection to the enterprise activity at all, either clearly from the circumstances or either under a constant jurisdiction of the courts. For example, there are certain things which they say cannot form part of an enterprise activity, like just holding shares in another business is usually not regarded by the courts as part of an entrepreneurial activity. If you just restrict yourself to a capital investment, this is not a part of an entrepreneurial activity, at least if you are not a bank or so. So ancillary enterprise activities do not form part of the core enterprise activities by definition, but they are those which happen occasionally or have a connection to it. It may also be that they happen only once, but they have something to do with the enterprise, and that's sufficient. So the only thing which is really out of scope of the enterprise is our Mr. Schmitz, who runs the bakery, decides to sell in a single act his private collection of stamps on eBay. This is neither his core activity nor an ancillary activity. By the way, things might be seen differently if Mr. Smith decided to sell constantly parts of his private stamp collection on eBay or on any competing platform. Please don't regard me as a marketing fellow of eBay, please. It was only the one and only example which just came to my mind. But the idea would then probably be, okay, if he does this constantly, and especially if he begins to rebuy some stamps and then to sell some others, then he might come near to a trading activity in stamps, a small business in stamps. So this might turn into a second core business, and surprise, now normally we would say that could be a small entrepreneurship and so uninteresting for VAT, but as Mr. Schmitz has only one enterprise and the bakery has already surpassed the limits of small entrepreneurship, a second additional core activity can no longer be protected by the small entrepreneurship rules. So indeed, if Mr. Schmitz began to sell and rebuy stamps on eBay on a constant basis, so that can no longer be seen as disposal of a private collection, but a kind of a trading activity, then this would be a part of his enterprise, a second core activity. So, surprise, if you ever have a client who runs as a sole trader or sole proprietor an enterprise, then you would have to monitor these persons' platform activities on platforms like eBay or Amazon marketplaces, rather more for professionals. But such nice secondary activities would have to be monitored more clearly because they are no longer protected by the small business rules. Good. But now you know everything which has a connection to the enterprise will be taxable. Especially everything which ends up in the bookkeeping of an enterprise naturally has a connection to the enterprise activities as a sum pool, with the potential exception of holding some capital investment shares. Examples how one can illustrate that, or some further examples how we can illustrate that. Imagine you are a business advisor, so a consultant, and now after years in the job, the Chamber of Commerce asks you to hold a speech with a small presentation about your job, just to get beginners interested in taking up the job or so. And as you are not far away from retirement, you do this and risk to motivate some future competitors, because you say, when they take up the job and really enter the market, I'll be gone, so I can accept the honor, speak in front of the Chamber of Commerce, raise up some future competitors. They will no longer be a worry for myself, but for my other competitors. So take this, and you get paid for that. If you now get paid for that, it's a service which you render for consideration. You are an entrepreneur, and naturally the speech has to do something with your enterprise, because you would never have got that order from the Chamber of Commerce if you had been a passenger on a cruise or so. They give it to you because of your professional activities, and so ancillary activity, it's something which the performance of your business brings along by chance. Yeah. Baker sells a used oven second hand. Actually, we had that example already. Clearly, connection to the enterprise. You can even set up an iron rule. Selling enterprise property has always a connection to the enterprise, and so always belongs to the scope of the enterprise. That can't be denied. The business card, the same. Very often you have the idea that beginners say, well, it's an accounting firm or so who is in play here. They don't trade in cars, so the car has nothing to do with what they do professionally. But surprise, no. They bought the car for business purposes, and so the car has become enterprise property. And so if you sell it in the long run, it will be a part of what the enterprise activities of an accounting firm bring along from time to time, that you have to dispose of some cars which you needed for your employees and for business travels. That has a sufficient connection to what happens inside the enterprise. Also, if the bakery owner has a business car and then takes it out of the business and dedicates it for private purposes in the future only, does it have a connection with the enterprise? And the answer is yes. You take out a business car from the enterprise. So the business car has, in the beginning, still a connection with the enterprise. That's sufficient to say what happens is within the scope of the enterprise, because making a withdrawal of goods or services from the enterprise happens in the course of running an enterprise, at least from time to time. So the connection is sufficient. Good. As you can see, everything which has to do with the enterprise is in the scope of the enterprise. And you can even say that everything which has to do or happens to enterprise property always also has to do with enterprise. So that makes it important for you and me to know what qualifies as enterprise property and what does not. So let us have a look on that. But before, let's clarify something. Nowadays, I have turned to wherever I'm aware of my language to speak of enterprise property, to make a distinction to business property, which is the income tax term. Probably you will catch me on several occasions where I forget about the distinction and mix the terms up. I apologize for that, but in the course of time, the more you think about things, you begin to also think about the usage of terms. And as I already told you, when we use business for determination of what income tax regards as a business, then we should use for VAT purposes a different term. And so I decided to use the term enterprise for VAT purposes. And naturally, then I should also speak of enterprise property instead of business property when we speak about VAT. Sorry if from time to time I forget about that, but that I think would be a good distinction. And you remember that even the German legal texts make a different usage of technical terms, because in the German legal language we would speak of Unternehmensvermögen when it is about value-added tax, about Umsatzsteuer, whereas in the field of income and corporate taxation we would call it Betriebsvermögen, business property. Good. That said, we can go on, and I can try to bring you into contact with the rules for what is regarded as enterprise property and what is not. The basic rule is simple. What is enterprise property is concluded from what is used by the owner for enterprise purposes. So a bakery oven is clearly used for the purpose to run the bakery, so it's enterprise property. You have no free choice there. That's clearly to be seen. Nobody has a bakery oven for private purposes only, or so. Don't know what you should do with that. So clearly enterprise property. With a car, things might be different. So there might also be genuinely private assets. Well, also there are clear cases and cases which are not so clear. What can't be used for enterprise purposes is non-entrepreneurial property, or what is not used for the enterprise. So we could also call it private property, although that brings along the risk that in your subconscious you might mix that up with the term from income tax. The non-entrepreneurial property is the one which is not used for business, for your enterprise. Now, what happens in cases where that is not clear? You will have to decide then, and we are going to talk about that immediately afterwards. But if you buy something for the enterprise, that has a positive and a negative consequence. The negative one is if you have enterprise property and sell it, then it belongs to the scope of the enterprise, so it will be taxable if the other conditions for taxability are met. If it's non-entrepreneurial property, it will not be taxable. On the other hand, when you buy something for the enterprise and it becomes entrepreneurial property, then you buy it for enterprise purposes, and for that, if you buy for your enterprise, you get input tax refund. So the value-added tax in the purchase price will be given back to you. You buy it, so in the final effect, at zero VAT burden. If you buy for private purposes, so for non-entrepreneurial purposes, you don't get a VAT refund. So you have always a combination of the positive and negative effect. You get the refund now, you will have to pay VAT on the sales price later. And then it depends, naturally, if below the lines this is positive or negative for you. That depends on how high or low the sales price is in comparison to the purchase price. Okay. So, yeah. If we have a clear usage no choice is possible. I already said that the bakery oven is entrepreneurial property. If the usage now is mixed partly for non-enterprise purposes, so mainly for private purposes, and partly for business purposes, which is, for example, frequently the case with a business card. Then the question is, how can we decide if something is entrepreneurial property or not? And the answer is surprising. You can freely decide. In that case, the jurisdiction says, so the courts say, that the law gives the entrepreneur a choice. Now you will be surprised. But the explanation is simple. When the case of that kind came to court, and the court of one European member state wanted to find out what the EU directive commanded on that question, then they found out there is no clear rule on that throughout the whole EU VAT directive. But on the other hand, from the system of the directive, it would be clear that there can now be different decisions throughout Europe. And the European Court of Justice so had to decide what is the order or the idea which the EU directive either explicitly or between the lines gives to the member state on the question of entrepreneurial property. And the court's judges sat together and then thought about the matter and found no rule and said, shit, we have forgotten that, or the legislator has forgotten to clearly make a decision. And then they said, okay, if there is no clear decision, then we should decide most favorably in the way which is most favorable to the taxpayers, and that would be give them a choice. Evidently, the legislating institutions did not want to forbid any of the present options which exist throughout the EU, and so they allowed either to decide that when you buy it, you dedicate such a mixed good to your enterprise, or you decide to regard it as a private asset, or you could even say, I split it up. That percentage of the good which I use for the enterprise is enterprise property. And that percentage of the good which I intend to use for private purposes is non-entrepreneurial property. So it would even be possible to say, if you buy a business car which you intend to use half of the time for private purposes, then you could decide to dedicate only half of the car, 50%, for the enterprise. And so when later you sell it, you would only have to charge VAT on 50% of the value of the car, because the other 50% of that car would be a private car part. By the way, in real life, at least here in Germany, nobody uses that option. They either fully decide for entrepreneurial usage or for private usage, because the rest is a bit too complicated, and in a way it would probably also shock a buyer if you later write an invoice where you split up the price of a car into two halves, or in 30% and 70%, and charge VAT on 30% only or so. So, but in theory, that possibility exists. Yeah. When that rule had been established, that if you have a mixed use, then naturally people began to think, how can we use that for cleverly for tax purposes? So a mixed use would already be a 1% usage for the enterprise and 99% for private purposes. So that would enable you or me to deduct the whole VAT on something which you buy at the moment of the purchase, and later then to tax the private usage as a withdrawal and to tax the whole price when you sell it again. But at least you would have immediately the full refund of the VAT in the purchase price at the beginning. And that made people think a bit in Germany. The administration here said, we will have people who then probably buy something which they intend for private to use only for private usage, and they use it once only for an hour for business purposes, and then want to deduct all the input tax. That's hard to check, and you can't practice that. So they asked the European Union for the permission to simplify things, and the European Commission gave them the permission to deviate from the VAT directive for reasons of simplification. Germany then just set up the rule that if you use something less than 10% of the time or of the potential usage for business purposes, then it cannot qualify for input tax deduction, because otherwise things would be too complicated. You can remember that probably from business administration, or no, not from business administration, but from general introduction to tax law or other things. When you speak about business property, Germany is used to the assumption that if there is less than 10% business usage, something cannot be business property, because there is no real business usage which really matters. Less than 10%, according to German tradition, is 0%. Less than 10% does not matter, it's not material, and so it will be ignored. Yeah. Quite nice. And that explains that peculiarity. But what you must keep in mind is that you cannot just take over the rules when something can become business property or not, that you cannot take over these rules to decide about entrepreneurial property or not, because in the field of VAT, we are in the field of legislation which is mainly and principally made by the European Union. So we cannot just say we assume that the European Union wanted to decide along the same lines as the German national legislator did in the field of income tax. That is the most important conclusion which you must store in the back of your minds. In the field of VAT, you cannot just take over the perspective which you have chosen or learned in the field of income taxation, because the legislators writing the rules are different in both cases. Well, okay. Now, in order to get some finish for today, there is one pitfall or trap which you must know when you design your behavior. You remember I told you, when you buy something for your enterprise property, you can deduct the input tax, and you will later have to pay VAT on the output when you sell it, because it has then a connection to your enterprise. On the other hand, when you buy something for your private sphere, no input tax deduction, and later no relevance for VAT when you sell it again, because it's not a part of the enterprise. Connection to the enterprise was missing. The pitfall, or the trap, or the mistake which you can make is now the following one. If you buy something as a private person, so for your private purposes, and then later open up a business or later contribute that asset for business, then you will not get an input tax refund at the moment when you contribute that asset, because you only get an input tax deduction or refund at the moment of purchase. When you don't buy something for your enterprise, the possibility for a refund later is lost. So a contribution of an asset into the enterprise does not enable you or entitle you to any refund anymore. So if there is a mixed usage intended, or if there is a change of usage intended in the course of time, it's always far better to buy for enterprise purposes from the beginning and then later change the purpose also. But when you once buy for private purposes, the refund possibilities are lost. That's especially of interest if somebody tries to start an enterprise. Because if you then, in the course of time, buy some assets, which you first only use as a private person, and later you all dedicate them for your enterprise, the refund possibilities are lost. You would then probably have to quarrel with the fiscal administration, intellectually, naturally, not by armed force, about when your entrepreneur status and when your enterprise started. You know, from the moment on, when you aimed at revenue by a constant activity, and so that was already your enterprise. So then you had an enterprise and you could buy for it. But on the other hand, when in the beginning clearly you bought for private purposes and then began to rededicate all that what you bought for enterprise purposes, then the refund is lost. For example, if you buy 2 camping vans, which you first intend to use for private purposes only, and then after a year you come to a, I could also let them for rent to other people, then that would be an enterprise activity. As you clearly said you did not intend that from the beginning onwards, you would get no input tax refund anymore. Good. Yeah, good or not good, depends. So let's finally sum up. The scope or range of the enterprise covers every activity of the same entrepreneur, and that forms only one enterprise. There are core activities and ancillary activities, and if you sell property which belongs to the enterprise or serves the enterprise, then selling it is always within the scope of the enterprise. But on the other hand, buying it is also within the scope of the enterprise, and that would enable you to input tax deduction. Good. That may be enough for this small video, and I see you back soon for a next video on what the term for consideration means, before we then go to analyzing terms like delivery and service, so the most important terms there. Thanks very much for watching. Would be great if you drop in soon again, and till then, enjoy the time and don't forget to come back. Thanks.